What if the man who publicly apologized to the church, his wife, and his son was still hiding the truth? You've heard his words, but what about the victims? Those who said their voices were never heard. Today, I will tell you how this story goes far deeper and darker than anyone expected. You won't believe what happened behind the scenes after Love Elias's apology. At first, people thought his apology was brave and honest. He stood in front of cameras in the church, said he had failed, and asked for forgiveness. But here is the shocking part. He never said exactly what he did wrong. His words were full of regret, but very vague. He didn't explain what mistakes he made or how he hurt those closest to him. It was almost like he read a carefully prepared speech that avoided real answers. Love Elias wasn't just a preacher or singer. He was a symbol of hope and faith for many people. He inspired thousands with his voice and passion. Many saw him as a devoted husband and father who stood strong for his family and community. When he apologized, the world stopped to listen because it felt like a man who had fallen from grace. But the apology was only the surface. Beneath it was a web of silence and secrets. Victims, people who said they had suffered because of Elias's actions, began to speak out. These were voices no one wanted to hear. One woman said she never wanted her story to be public. She only wanted someone to believe her. She talked about years of feeling trapped, controlled by a leader who was supposed to protect and guide her. Another victim was a young man whose faith was broken. He said the church told him to forgive and move on, but no one held Elias accountable. These were not just one or two stories. They formed a pattern of complaints ignored, of pain brushed aside in the name of protecting the church's image. The craziest part was that even after the apology, victims felt pressured to stay silent. Destiny took an unexpected turn when these quiet voices finally broke the silence. People started to realize that the apology was only part of a bigger, more complicated story. The church's response made things even more confusing. At first, there was silence. Then some public statements praised Elias for his honesty and humility. But there was no real plan to support those who were hurt, no real investigation into what happened or how the leaders may have failed. Church members were divided. Some defended Elias, remembering his years of service. Others were angry and felt betrayed by a system that cared more about controlling the damage than seeking justice. One insider even said the apology felt like a performance, something made for the cameras but not backed by real change. Publicly, Elias's wife and son accepted the apology, speaking about forgiveness and healing. But behind closed doors, the story was very different. His family faced emotional turmoil, struggling with betrayal and confusion. This was how a public apology shattered a family's life, affecting their marriage, their child, and Elias's entire legacy. What makes this story different is that it isn't just about one man's fall. It reveals a church culture that often chooses silence over truth, charisma over character, and protects leaders instead of victims. This is where it gets interesting. The apology opened a much-needed debate about faith, power, and accountability. The story didn't end with just one apology. Instead, it sparked a conversation that many in the church community had been avoiding for years. Experts and insiders began to speak out about a culture where protecting the image of spiritual leaders often came before protecting the people who were hurt. This wasn't just about Love Elias alone. It was about a system that too often ignored victims and gave second chances to those in power. You won't believe how deep this problem ran. Many survivors said their complaints were swept under the rug, dismissed as misunderstandings, or blamed on their own weaknesses. The church, which should have been a place of safety and healing, became a place where silence was demanded and fear grew. As this debate grew louder, some church members walked away, feeling wounded and confused. Others held on, hoping for change, refusing to believe that the community they loved could be so broken. But here is the shocking part. Change is possible. Across the country, some churches faced similar scandals and responded by creating new systems of accountability. They introduced independent boards to review complaints, offered real support to victims, and set up safe ways to report abuse or misconduct. This was how some communities started to heal, by putting truth and justice ahead of image and power. Still, many feared that without real transparency, these scandals would keep happening. The apology, instead of closing a chapter, became the beginning of a long and difficult fight for reform. What makes this story different is the way it challenged spiritual institutions to ask hard questions. Are we protecting people or just protecting power? Are we truly listening to survivors, or are we silencing them to save face? The answers were not easy, and for many, their faith was shaken. It was painful to realize that the leaders they trusted might have betrayed them, and that the institutions built on faith sometimes failed to stand up for justice. In the middle of this storm was Lovy Elias' family. His wife struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion. His son was torn between admiration for his father and heartbreak over the scandal. This wasn't just a public controversy, it was a family crisis playing out in private. The craziest part was how public forgiveness was so different from private pain. Behind the smiles and statements of unity, there was emotional turmoil and doubt. This is where it gets interesting. The apology didn't just affect Elias's reputation, it changed everything about his life and the lives of those closest to him. The victims, the family, the church community, all were caught in a story much bigger than anyone imagined. And destiny took an unexpected turn when people refused to accept silence any longer. The conversation moved from whispers to headlines and from denial to demands for truth. Now, more than ever, the need for transparency and accountability was clear. The apology was just the beginning. What followed would test the strength of the church, the courage of survivors, and the power of faith itself. As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that the apology from Lovy Elias was just the surface of a much larger issue within the church community. Many people started to ask questions that no one had dared to ask before. What really happened behind closed doors? Why were so many voices ignored for so long? And most importantly, who was going to take responsibility? The silence from the church leaders was deafening, and many felt betrayed by an institution that was supposed to stand for truth and justice. The victims who finally spoke out shared heartbreaking stories of emotional manipulation and betrayal. One woman described how she felt trapped for years, caught between her faith and the fear of speaking up. She said that the church valued its image more than the truth, and anyone who dared to speak was punished with isolation or disbelief. A young man said his faith was destroyed after he was told to forgive and move on without any real accountability. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They painted a picture of a culture that prioritized protecting its leaders over protecting its people. The craziest part was that even after the apology, these victims felt pressure to stay silent, as if their pain was something to be hidden rather than healed. Behind the public apology, there were whispers of a church community divided. Some members stood by Elias, remembering his years of service and the comfort he had brought to their lives. Others were filled with anger and sadness, feeling that the church had failed them in the worst possible way. The church's careful public statements about grace and forgiveness seemed empty to many, especially because no real changes were made to support victims or prevent future harm. This is where it gets interesting. The apology, while public and emotional, seemed more like a carefully crafted performance than a genuine step toward healing. Meanwhile, inside Elias's family, things were far from peaceful. His wife was dealing with feelings of betrayal and confusion, struggling to understand the man she thought she knew. His son found himself caught between loyalty to his father and heartbreak over the scandal that was shaking their family. The emotional turmoil inside the home was a sharp contrast to the public messages of forgiveness and unity. This was how a man's fall from grace had shattered not just his reputation, but his family and community as well. What makes this story different is that it's not just about one individual or one apology. It is a reflection of a larger system that often protects power and image instead of truth and healing. Experts warn that unless real transparency and reform happen, scandals like this will continue to happen again and again. The apology opened a critical debate. Are spiritual institutions willing to change? Are they ready to listen to survivors and hold their leaders accountable? For many, the faith they once trusted was now tested in painful and unexpected ways. The apology from Love Elias may have dominated headlines for a while, but the real story stayed in the shadows, in the quiet voices of those who said they were hurt, dismissed, and silenced. Their stories mattered and their pain was real. Many people began to realize that true healing would not come from just words, but from actions. The church needed to do more than offer apologies. It needed to offer justice, compassion, and real change. This wasn't about punishing one man. It was about creating a community where no one was above the truth, no matter how beloved or powerful they might be. Some churches, inspired by similar scandals, began taking serious steps. They set up independent oversight boards to make sure complaints were heard and handled fairly. They created safe systems where victims could come forward without fear of being ignored or punished. They focused on healing, not just saving their image. Destiny took an unexpected turn when these changes showed that faith communities could be places of safety and truth, not silence and fear. But here is the shocking part. Many still resisted. Some church members couldn't let go of the image they had of Elias, clinging to hope in denial. Others had already left, wounded and angry, unable to trust again. The debate was far from over. It was clear that this apology was not the end, but the beginning of a difficult journey for everyone involved. What makes this story different is the way it forced a community to confront its deepest fears and failings. The apology, once seen as a closure, had opened a door to difficult questions about faith and justice. The craziest part of all is how this controversy continues to affect lives long after the cameras stop rolling. The church culture that allowed such silence and protection of leaders must change if it wants to survive. The real victory will come when victims feel heard, when families like Elias's find peace, and when faith is rebuilt on truth, not secrets. So where does that leave us now? This story is far from over. The voices of the victims, the calls for accountability, and the demand for change will keep growing louder. If the church truly wants to heal, it must listen, not just offer words, but take action. The apology from Lovy Elias was just the start, and the future depends on what happens next. If you found this story eye-opening and believe these conversations matter, please share it with others. Let's create space for real dialogue, healing, and truth. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and stay vocal.